Welcome to Social Studies Simplified. In our last lesson, we talked about the meaning of history, what it is, how it began, and why it matters. Today, we'll take it a step further. We'll look at the issues and questions that historians face when studying the past. History is not just about collecting facts, it is also about asking, whose stories are told? Whose voices are heard? How do we know what really happened? And whose stories are left out? As we go through this lesson, I want you to reflect, think of one person in your family whose story is not in books but deserves to be remembered. If you're watching on YouTube, share that person's story in the comments, I'd love to read about them. In the earliest works after Herodotus and Thucydides, most historical records came from written sources. And who had the power to leave written records? The kings, the nobles, the military heroes, the clergy, the scholars. In other words, the elite. That means history, for a long time, was mostly about wars, revolutions, and big political events, stories of the powerful. But what about ordinary people? The peasants, workers, women and indigenous communities? For a time, their voices were absent. Do they not have history simply because they left behind no written records? This is one of the big issues we face when studying history. It often centers on the powerful, while the voices of the powerless are forgotten. Who do you think is most left out of Philippine history? Why? Tell me in the comments so we can compare ideas. By the 19th century, a philosophy called Positivism became popular. It said that knowledge is only real if it can be observed and proven. Applied to history, this became the rule: no document, no history. This made history more scientific. That meant if there was no written record, the event wasn't considered part of history. Sounds logical, right? But here's the problem: not everyone left documents. Positivism often privileged the voices of the rich and powerful, while ignoring others. The elites had plenty of records, but the poor, the marginalized, and the indigenous often did not. Does that mean they had no history? Of course not. But for a long time, positivism made historians blind to those voices. Reflection time: if history only relied on documents, what parts of Filipino culture would disappear or be erased? Type your thoughts in the comments, I'll be checking them out. Later, historians realized this was a problem. They began using other kinds of sources: oral traditions, songs, epics, artifacts, architecture, even memories. Historians also started working with other fields. Archaeologists help by studying artifacts. Linguists trace language changes and connections. Even scientists like biologists and geneticists can study DNA to show how people migrated or interacted in the past. History became more inclusive and interdisciplinary, no longer just about the elite, but about everyone. That means we use many fields to recover voices that might have been silenced in the past. Share in the comments section an example of a local tradition, song, or practice in your community that you believe could serve as a historical source. This is a great way for us to learn from each other. This brings us to a very important concept: historiography. If history is the study of past events, historiography is the study of how history itself is written. Historiography asks questions like: who wrote this historical text? Why did they write it? What sources did they use? What methods guided them? By studying historiography, we don't just learn facts, we also understand how those facts were selected, interpreted, and even influenced by the historian's own context. It teaches us to be critical thinkers. Think about Jose Rizal's Nali Mi Tanher. Do you see it as just a story, or also as a historical source? Why? Write down your answer and share it in the comments. Different times had different purposes for writing history. In the time of Herodotus, history was written so future generations could learn from the past. In the medieval period, when the church was powerful, history was seen as part of God's divine plan. In the 19th century, Historicism argued that history should be studied only for its own sake, not for politics or religion. And today, history is also used to respond to present-day issues. For example, subfields like women's history or environmental history emerged because of current social issues. So the question is, what do we want history to do for us now? In today's world, do you think history should focus more on facts or on lessons? Comment your answer below. I'm curious which side you'll take. Here comes the big debate. Historicism, represented by Leopold von Ranke, argues that history should be neutral, objective, and only focused on the past. But critics like Benedetto Croce said, all history is contemporary history, meaning every historian is influenced by their own present time. So the debate is this: should history be studied only for the past's sake, or should it also serve society today? Think about it, do we study history just to know, or also to act? Which side are you on, Ranke's idea that history should be purely objective, or Croce's idea that history always reflects the present? Tell me your stand in the comments. Here's something we must never forget: history can be used, positive, and abused, negative. Positively, it teaches lessons, strengthens identity, and guides the future. But it can also be abused, used as propaganda, to distort truth, or to erase accountability. Governments and leaders have often distorted history to serve their agenda. The Americans once described Filipinos as uncivilized to justify colonization. Nazi Germany rewrote history to fuel nationalism and war. Even today, some groups try to revise or beautify the Marcos era as a so-called golden age, despite its corruption and abuses. That's why historians have a huge responsibility to protect truth from manipulation. Can you give a recent example where you saw history being used, or abused, on social media? Share your example in the comments. This will help us see how history is alive in today's world. So if history is not just about facts, then why study it? The answers are many. History shows us mistakes of the past, but also good ideas and alternatives. It helps us navigate current problems by giving us perspective. It gives us self-knowledge. As R.G. Collingwood said, the value of history is that it teaches us what man has done, and thus what man is. In short, history doesn't just tell us who we were. It helps us understand who we are, and what we can become. That's the real power of studying history. Before we end, complete this sentence: for me, studying history is important because. Write it down, and if you're watching on YouTube, drop your answer in the comments so we can build a wall of reflections together. So, history is not static. It is alive, constantly questioned, debated, and reinterpreted. It is not only about kings and wars, but also about ordinary people whose voices must be heard. It is not only about the past but also about how we understand the present and shape the future. And in our next lesson, we will explore the historian. That's it for today's lesson. If you found this helpful, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you won't miss the next one. This is Social Studies Simplified, where we understand the past, engage the present, and shape the future.